The fine arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a woman named Patricia who wore pearls at 10 in the morning and had the kind of smile that could curdle milk. I was in my backyard, making final adjustments to my brand new observatory dome, when she marched across my lawn like she owned it. "Are you Benjamin Norris?" she asked, already knowing the answer. I wiped grease off my hands with a rag and nodded. "That's me." She thrust an envelope at me with perfectly manicured nails painted the color of dried blood. "This is an official notice from the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association. You have violated Section 12.4 of the Community Guidelines regarding unauthorized structures." I looked at the dome behind me, a beautiful 12-foot diameter structure I had spent 6 months planning and 3 weeks installing. Inside was a Celestron telescope I had saved 2 years to afford, mounted on a custom pier I had poured myself. It was my dream, my escape from the stress of running my software company, my window to the universe. Unauthorized, I submitted the architectural review forms 8 months ago. Patricia's smile grew sharper. "And they were denied 6 months ago. Perhaps you should check your mail more carefully." "I never received any denial letter." "That's not our problem. The fine is $500, due within 30 days. Additionally, you must remove the structure within 60 days or face daily penalties of $100. She walked away before I could respond, her heels clicking on my driveway like gunshots. I tore open the envelope and found a 3-page document outlining my violations in excruciating detail. The language was dense and legal, designed to intimidate. At the bottom was Patricia's signature along with her title, HOA President. I went inside and searched through 6 months of mail, every folder in my email, every spam directory. Nothing. No denial letter, no communication at all after my initial submission. I called the HOA office and got voicemail. I called again an hour later. Voicemail. I sent an email and received an auto reply saying responses could take up to 10 business days. That evening, I walked the neighborhood. Meadowbrook Heights was an upscale development in Chandler, Arizona, filled with $500,000 homes and manicured lawns that looked like golf courses. I had moved here 3 years ago when my software company, Orion Systems, had landed a major contract with a defense contractor. The neighborhood was quiet, clean, and close to my office in downtown Phoenix. As I walked, I noticed things I had never paid attention to before. The Martinez family had a storage shed that was easily larger than my observatory dome. The Hendersons had installed a gazebo without any visible approval documents posted. 3 houses had basketball hoops permanently mounted in their driveways, which I was pretty sure violated the same Section 12.4. I took photos of everything. The next morning, I drove to the HOA office, a small suite in a strip mall near the neighborhood entrance. Patricia was there, along with another woman who introduced herself as Carol, the HOA secretary. Carol had the look of someone who had given up on life sometime in the early 2000s and was just coasting toward retirement. "I want to appeal this fine," I said, laying the notice on Patricia's desk. "I never received a denial of my architectural review." Patricia did not even look at the paper. "Appeals must be submitted in writing and will be reviewed at the next board meeting, which is in 6 weeks. 6 weeks. The fine is due in 30 days. Then I suggest you pay it promptly to avoid late fees." "What about all the other violations in the neighborhood? The sheds, the gazebos, the basketball hoops?" Patricia's expression could have frozen the surface of the sun. "Those structures were properly approved through the architectural review process. I'd like to see the approval documents." "That information is available to board members only. I'm a homeowner. I have a right to review HOA documents. Carol finally spoke up, her voice timid. The bylaws state that document requests must be submitted in writing with a processing fee of $50 per request and allow up to 60 days for fulfillment. I felt my jaw clench. This was not about rules or community standards. This was about power and control. Patricia had decided she did not like my observatory dome, and she was going to use every bureaucratic weapon in her arsenal to make me remove it. Fine, I said. I'll submit everything in writing. I spent that evening drafting a 5-page appeal, citing every relevant section of the HOA bylaws, attaching photos of my initial submission with timestamps, and including evidence of selective enforcement. I delivered it personally the next morning and paid the $50 document request fee in cash, getting a receipt from a very uncomfortable-looking Carol. 2 weeks passed. No response. The telescope sat unused in my dome while I waited for some acknowledgement that my appeal was being processed. I called daily and got voicemail every time. My emails went unanswered. Then, on day 16, I received another letter. This one informed me that my appeal had been reviewed and denied. The board found no evidence of procedural irregularities and upheld the original fine and removal order. The letter was dated 3 days after I had submitted my appeal, which meant they had not even bothered to wait for the board meeting they claimed was necessary. I was angry now, genuinely angry in a way I had not been since my divorce 5 years ago. But anger without strategy is just noise. I needed information, leverage, something that would let me fight back effectively. That weekend, I went to the Maricopa County Recorder's office and pulled every document related to Meadowbrook Heights HOA. The original CC and Articus, every amendment, every board election record, every financial disclosure. It took 6 hours of reading through barely legible scanned documents, but I found what I was looking for. The HOA's Architectural Review Committee was required to have 5 members. Currently, it had 2, Patricia and a man named Douglas Webb, who lived 4 houses down from me. Every decision they had made for the past 18 months was potentially invalid because they did not have a quorum. I also found the HOA's financial disclosures. Patricia paid herself $60,000 a year as HOA president, despite the bylaws stating that board positions were volunteer only. She had also approved a landscape contract with a company called Desert Bloom Landscaping for $200,000 annually, which seemed excessive for a neighborhood of 80 homes. I ran a corporate search on Desert Bloom Landscaping. The registered agent was Gregory Marsh. I ran another search on Gregory Marsh and found that he was married to Patricia Marsh. She was funneling HOA money to her husband's company. I could have gone to the police right then. What Patricia was doing was almost certainly fraud, maybe embezzlement. But I was not interested in criminal charges, not yet. I wanted something more immediate, more satisfying. I wanted to hit her where it hurt. I spent the next week researching everything about Meadowbrook Heights infrastructure. Water was provided by the city of Chandler. Internet and cable were through Cox Communications. But electricity was interesting. Very interesting. The neighborhood was serviced by a small private utility company called Southwest Grid Services. I had never paid much attention to who provided my power. The bill came every month. I paid it. The lights stayed on. But Southwest Grid Services was not one of the big players like APS or SRP. It was a small, independent operation that had been founded in the 1980s to service new developments on the edge of the Phoenix metro area. I called their main office and asked to speak with someone about their service area. After being transferred 3 times, I ended up talking to a man named Richard who worked in operations. "Yeah, we service Meadowbrook Heights," Richard said, "along with about 15 other neighborhoods in that area." "Why do you ask?" "Just curious about the company. Are you publicly traded?" "Nope, private, family-owned. The founder's grandson runs it now, but between you and me, he's looking to retire. Been trying to sell for about 2 years. My heart started beating faster. "Sell the whole company?" "Yeah, the whole operation. Grid infrastructure, service contracts, everything. It's a good little business, steady revenue, but it's not growing much. Kids these days don't want to run utility companies, I guess." "Do you know what they're asking?" Richard laughed. "Way above my pay grade, friend, but I've heard numbers around 12 to 15 million. "Why, you in the market?" "Maybe," I said. "Who would I talk to about that?" He gave me the name and number of the owner, a man named Robert Chen. I sat in my office for an hour, staring at my phone. 12 to 15 million dollars was a lot of money, but it was not impossible money. Orion Systems had been profitable for 6 straight years. We had 8 million in retained earnings, and I personally had another 4 million in various investments. I could probably secure financing for the rest if the deal made sense. But did I really want to buy a utility company just to spite an HOA president? I looked out my window at the observatory dome in my backyard. Yes, I did. I called Robert Chen that afternoon. He was cautious at first, probably assuming I was a time waster, but when I explained that I ran a software company and was interested in diversifying into infrastructure investments, he warmed up. We agreed to meet the following Tuesday at his office in Mesa. Robert was in his late 60s, with gray hair and the tired eyes of someone who had spent 40 years dealing with power outages and customer complaints. His office was cluttered with engineering diagrams and regulatory binders. "Southwest Grid Services has been in my family since my father started it in 1983, he said, pouring coffee into mugs that had probably not been washed since the Clinton administration. "We built it from nothing, stringing lines to new developments that the big utilities did not want to bother with. It's been good to us, but I'm ready to do something else with my time." "What's the service area like?" I asked. He pulled out a map and spread it across his desk. "We cover about 30 square miles in Chandler and Gilbert, mostly residential, some light commercial, about 4,000 customer accounts, mix of homes and businesses. Infrastructure is in good shape. We've been upgrading to smart meters over the past 5 years. Revenue, steady. We gross about 6 million annually. Net profit is usually around 800,000 after all expenses, maintenance, salaries, regulatory compliance. It's not going to make anyone rich, but it's consistent." "Why sell?" Robert leaned back in his chair. "Honestly, I'm 71 years old. My son is a doctor. My daughter teaches at ASU. Neither of them wants to run a power company. I could hire a management team and keep collecting checks, but I'd rather sell now while I can still enjoy the money. Travel with my wife, spend time with grandkids, all that." We talked for 2 more hours. He showed me financial statements going back 10 years, maintenance records, regulatory compliance documents. Everything looked legitimate and well managed. The asking price was $13.5 million. "I'll need to do due diligence," I said. "Bring in some people to review the books, inspect the infrastructure, all that." "Expected," Robert said. "Take your time. I'm not in a hurry." I hired a firm that specialized in utility acquisitions. They spent 3 weeks crawling through every aspect of Southwest Grid Services. The verdict came back clean. The infrastructure was solid, the finances were accurate, and the regulatory situation was stable. The only potential issue was that some of the service contracts were up for renewal in the next 18 months, but that was normal churn. The bigger challenge was financing. I could put together about $11 million between Orion Systems' cash reserves and my personal investments, but I needed another $2.5 million. Banks were hesitant to lend for such an unusual acquisition, especially to someone with no utility experience. Then I had an idea. I called my 3 biggest clients, all of whom had been with Orion Systems since the early days. I explained that I was making a strategic acquisition and was looking for investment partners. 2 of them passed, but the third, a venture capital guy named Marcus who had made a fortune in tech, was intrigued. A utility company. That's old school, Ben. What's the angle? Stable revenue, hard assets, essential service. It's the opposite of tech volatility. And what do you really want it for? I hesitated, then decided honesty was the best approach. There's a personal element. The HOA in my neighborhood has been making my life difficult. Owning the utility that services them gives me leverage. Marcus laughed, a genuine belly laugh. That's the most petty thing I've ever heard. I love it. How much do you need? $2.5 million. I'll give you 20% equity in the utility. Make it 25% and you've got a deal. We shook hands over lunch at a steakhouse in Scottsdale. 3 weeks later, the papers were signed. Southwest Grid Services was mine, or mostly mine. Marcus had his quarter share, but I controlled operations and strategy. The transfer took another month to process through all the regulatory agencies. The Arizona Corporation Commission had to approve the change in ownership, which required public notices and a hearing. Patricia actually showed up to the hearing, though she had no idea I was the buyer. She testified that Southwest Grid Services had been a reliable provider, and she hoped the new owner would maintain the same level of service. I sat in the back of the room and said nothing. On October 15th, I officially took control of Southwest Grid Services. I spent the first week meeting with the staff, all 23 of them, from the line workers to the customer service reps. I made it clear that I was not planning any layoffs or major changes. The company worked well, and I wanted to keep it that way. Then I turned my attention to Meadowbrook Heights. I pulled every account record for the neighborhood. 87 residential accounts, all current on payments. Average usage was pretty standard for Arizona homes with air conditioning. Nothing unusual except for one account that used nearly triple the electricity of any other home, Patricia's house. I dug deeper into her usage patterns. She was running her air conditioning at levels that suggested she was keeping her house at about 65 degrees year-round. She also had some kind of heavy equipment running in her garage 24/7, based on the consistent base load even during times when a normal home would drop to minimal usage. I filed that information away for later. The 60-day deadline for removing my observatory dome was approaching. I had paid the original $500 fine under protest, but I had no intention of removing the dome. On day 59, I received another letter from Patricia, informing me that daily fines of $100 would begin the next day and continue until the structure was removed. That evening, I drove to Patricia's house. It was one of the largest in the neighborhood, with a 3-car garage and a pool that I could see through the side gate. I rang the doorbell and waited. Patricia answered wearing a tennis outfit that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payment. Her expression soured when she saw me. "Mr. Norris, have you come to inform me that you're finally complying with community standards?" "Actually, I wanted to discuss your electricity usage." She blinked, confused. "My what? Your electricity usage? You're using an extraordinary amount of power. I'm concerned there might be an equipment malfunction or a safety issue." "I don't see how that's any of your business." "It's very much my business. You see, I recently acquired Southwest Grid Services. I'm your power provider now." The color drained from Patricia's face. For the first time since I had met her, she was speechless. "As I was saying," I continued, keeping my tone friendly and professional, "your usage patterns are unusual. I'd like to schedule an inspection to make sure everything is operating safely. It's standard procedure for anomalous accounts. You can't just inspect my home without permission." "Actually, per the service agreement you signed, Southwest Grid Services has the right to inspect customer equipment if we suspect a safety hazard or unauthorized usage. But I'm trying to be neighborly about it. How's Thursday afternoon?" Patricia's mouth opened and closed like a fish. "This is harassment. This is utility service management. I take safety very seriously. I'd hate for there to be an electrical fire or something. Those can spread quickly in neighborhoods like this." I left her standing in the doorway and walked back to my house. The next morning, I received an email from Carol, not Patricia, informing me that the HOA board had decided to table the enforcement action on my observatory dome pending further review. I sent a polite reply thanking them for their reconsideration. But I was not done. Not by a long shot. Over the next 2 weeks, I conducted a comprehensive audit of every HOA-related account. The HOA office itself had an account for their strip mall suite. Desert Bloom Landscaping, Patricia's husband's company, had accounts for their business office and equipment storage facility. I also discovered that Patricia had registered a second business account under a different name, something called Meadowbrook Management Services. I pulled the records for Meadowbrook Management Services and found that it was billing the HOA $36,000 per year for administrative services. As far as I could tell, it was another shell company that Patricia controlled, giving her another revenue stream from the HOA's funds. Between her salary, her husband's landscape contract, and this management services company, Patricia was extracting close to $300,000 per year from the HOA. The annual dues for each homeowner were $1,800, which meant the 87 homes were generating about $157,000. The math did not work unless she was also dipping into the reserve fund. I requested the HOA's reserve fund records through another written request, paying another $50 processing fee. Carol looked absolutely miserable when I came to pick up the documents 2 weeks later. "Is everything okay?" I asked her. She glanced toward Patricia's closed office door. "I really can't talk about HOA business with residents outside of official channels. Carol, if something's wrong, you can tell me. This is a safe space." She shook her head quickly and handed me a manila envelope with the reserve fund records. As I turned to leave, she said quietly, "Check the transfer records from 2019. I took the envelope home and spread the documents across my dining room table. The HOA's reserve fund was supposed to maintain a balance of at least $200,000 for emergency repairs and long-term maintenance. The current balance was $87,000. In 2019, there had been a series of transfers totaling $130,000, all labeled as emergency infrastructure repairs. I cross-referenced these with the HOA's other records and found no corresponding invoices, no contractor payments, no documentation of any actual repairs. Patricia had stolen it, just taken it directly from the reserve fund and probably funneled it into one of her company's or personal accounts. I made copies of everything and took them to a lawyer friend of mine, Jennifer, who specialized in white-collar crime defense, but also did some prosecution work as a special prosecutor for the county. "This is pretty blatant," Jennifer said, flipping through the documents. If you can prove she authorized these transfers and they went to her benefit, that's embezzlement. Could be fraud, theft, breach of fiduciary duty. Take your pick. What kind of penalties are we talking about for $130,000? That's a Class 3 felony in Arizona. Could be up to 8 years in prison, restitution, fines, and that's just criminal. The HOA could sue her civilly for damages too. What do I need to do? You could go to the police directly, but honestly, financial crimes aren't usually their priority unless there's a lot of money involved, or it's connected to something bigger. Your better bet might be to present this to the HOA membership and force her out, then decide as a group whether to pursue criminal charges. I thought about it for a few days. The nuclear option would be satisfying, but it would also be messy and drawn out. What I really wanted was for Patricia to leave me alone and to stop stealing from my neighbors. Then I had a better idea. I drafted a letter and had Jennifer review it to make sure it was legally sound. The letter outlined everything I had discovered: the invalid architectural review committee, the self-dealing contracts, the missing reserve funds, all of it. It concluded with a simple offer. Patricia would resign immediately as HOA president. She and her husband would terminate their contracts with the HOA, and she would return $130,000 to the reserve fund. In exchange, I would not pursue criminal charges or civil action. She had 72 hours to decide. I delivered the letter personally, handing it to Patricia in the HOA office with Carol as a witness. Patricia read it with increasingly pale skin, her hands shaking by the time she reached the end. "You can't prove any of this," she said, but her voice was weak. "I can prove all of it. I have the documents, the bank records, the timeline. I've already had a prosecutor review the evidence. She says it's a slam dunk. This is blackmail." "No, this is me offering you a way out of a prison sentence. Take the deal or don't, but you've got 3 days." I walked out, leaving her holding the letter like it was radioactive. 71 hours later, I received an email from an attorney representing Patricia. She accepted the terms. She would resign, effective immediately, and would wire $130,000 to the HOA's reserve fund account within 10 business days. The landscape and management contracts would be terminated by the end of the month. I forwarded the email to every homeowner in Meadowbrook Heights, along with a summary of what Patricia had been doing and copies of the supporting documents. I wanted everyone to know exactly what kind of person had been running their HOA. The neighborhood erupted. My phone rang constantly with neighbors calling to thank me or express shock, or ask what would happen next. A few people were angry, claiming I had overstepped or that this should have been handled internally. But the majority were grateful that someone had finally stood up to Patricia. An emergency HOA meeting was called for the following week. 200 people crammed into the community center, which had a maximum occupancy of about 150. People were standing in the hallways, sitting on the floor, leaning against walls. Everyone wanted to see what would happen. Carol ran the meeting, since Patricia had resigned, and the vice president, Douglas Webb, had also stepped down after I revealed that he had known about at least some of Patricia's schemes. Carol looked terrified but determined. "We need to elect a new board," she said, her voice barely audible over the crowd noise. "Someone nominated me. I declined, explaining that I did not have the time to commit to it properly. Instead, I nominated a neighbor named Sarah, a retired accountant who had always been active in community events. She was elected unanimously, along with 4 other residents who seemed genuinely interested in serving the community rather than enriching themselves. The new board's first action was to commission an independent audit of all HOA finances going back 5 years. Their second action was to dissolve the Architectural Review Committee and establish a new one with proper membership and transparent procedures. Their third action was to formally approve my observatory dome, along with a handful of other structures that had been in bureaucratic limbo. Patricia's wire transfer came through on day 9, putting the reserve fund back to a healthy balance. She and her husband moved out of the neighborhood 2 months later, putting their house on the market and taking a significant loss because they were desperate to sell quickly. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that they had relocated to Tucson. As for me, I finally got to use my observatory dome. I spent the first clear night after the approval sitting in front of my telescope, watching Jupiter and its moons dance across the field of view. The seeing was pretty good for Arizona, and I could make out the Great Red Spot and some of the band structures in the atmosphere. Running Southwest grid services turned out to be more interesting than I had expected. The company more or less ran itself, with the operations team handling day-to-day issues while I focused on strategic planning. I invested in more smart grid technology and started exploring renewable energy integration. Marcus was happy because the investment was performing exactly as projected, steady and reliable. I kept my day job at Orion Systems, but I found myself spending more time thinking about infrastructure and utilities. There was something satisfying about running a business that provided an essential service, something that people needed every single day. Software was great, but at the end of the day, it was all abstract. Electricity was real. You could measure it, see its effects, know that you were keeping people's lights on and their homes cool during Arizona summers. 6 months after Patricia left, I was in my backyard one evening, setting up the telescope for a viewing session when my doorbell rang. I walked around front and found Carol standing on my porch, holding a casserole dish. "Hi," she said nervously. "I made too much lasagna and thought you might want some." I invited her in, and we ended up talking for 3 hours. She told me about how Patricia had bullied her for years, threatening to fire her if she ever spoke up about the financial irregularities. She had known something was wrong but had been too scared to do anything about it. She felt guilty for her silence. "You did speak up," I reminded her. "You told me to check those transfer records. That's what broke the whole thing open." "I should have done it sooner. I should have been braver." Bravery isn't about never being scared. It's about doing the right thing even when you are scared. We became friends after that. Carol stayed on as HOA secretary under the new board, and seemed much happier without Patricia's constant presence. The neighborhood slowly returned to normal, though there was definitely more scrutiny of HOA finances and decisions. The new board published monthly financial reports and held open meetings where any resident could ask questions. I won't say everything was perfect. There were still disputes about lawn maintenance and paint colors, and whether someone's Christmas decorations were too elaborate. That's just the nature of HOAs. But the culture shifted from authoritarian enforcement to collaborative problem-solving. When issues came up, people talked about them like adults instead of wielding bylaws like weapons. My favorite part was watching other residents start to engage with astronomy. Once word got around that I had a serious telescope set up, people started asking if they could come over and look through it. I started hosting monthly star parties, where anyone in the neighborhood could stop by and view whatever was interesting that night. Kids loved seeing Saturn's rings for the first time. Adults loved seeing the Andromeda galaxy and realizing they were looking at light that had traveled 2.5 million years to reach their eyes. The observatory dome, the the structure that had started this whole mess, became one of the neighborhood's most popular features. Parents would bring their children over for impromptu science lessons. Teachers from local schools would schedule field trips. A few residents got so interested that they bought their own telescopes and started learning the sky. One evening, about a year after everything had gone down, I was giving a tour of the night sky to a group of families. We were looking at the moon, working our way through the major craters and seas when someone asked, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you had just taken the dome down?" I thought about it for a moment. Honestly, I probably would have. It would have been easier to comply than to fight, but something about the way Patricia handled it just felt wrong. It wasn't about rules or community standards. It was about power and control. "So you bought an entire power company to prove a point," someone else joked. I bought a power company because it was a good investment that also happened to give me leverage in a bad situation. The fact that it worked out is kind of satisfying, though. Everyone laughed, and we went back to looking at the moon. Southwest Grid Services continued to grow slowly but steadily. We picked up a few new developments that were being built on the east side of Gilbert, expanding our service area by about 15%. The revenue increase meant I could invest more in infrastructure improvements and renewable energy projects. We installed a small solar farm that could generate about 5% of our peak demand, with plans to expand it over time. Marcus and I talked periodically about the possibility of acquiring other small utilities and building a larger regional operation, but I was not sure I wanted to scale up that much. There was something nice about running a business that was big enough to matter, but small enough that I could still understand every aspect of it. Ryan's systems kept humming along too. We landed a few more defense contracts and started branching out into civilian applications of our secure communication software. I hired a COO to handle more of the day-to-day operations, which freed up my time to think strategically about both companies. Life was good. Better than good, actually. I had 2 successful businesses, a hobby I was passionate about, and a community that felt like an actual community instead of just a collection of houses that happened to be near each other. About 18 months after Patricia left, I was at the grocery store when I ran into her. She was alone, pushing a cart through the produce section, looking older and more tired than I remembered. We made eye contact, and for a moment I thought she might just turn and walk away. Instead, she came over to me. "Benjamin," she said quietly. "Patricia. I heard you're still in Meadowbrook Heights. I thought you might have moved." "Why would I move? I like my house. I like the neighborhood." She nodded slowly, not meeting my eyes. "I want you to know that I paid back every cent I took. Well, eventually. It took selling the house and liquidating some investments, but the HOA got their money." "I know. I saw the transfer records." "Right. Of course you did." She paused, then added, "I'm sorry for what I did. To you, to the neighborhood, to everyone. I convinced myself I deserved that money, that I was working hard and should be compensated. But I knew it was wrong. I knew it the whole time. I did not know what to say to that." Part of me wanted to tell her that her apology meant nothing, that she had stolen from her neighbors and abused her position and deserved whatever consequences she faced. But another part of me just felt tired of the anger. "I hope things are better for you in Tucson," I said finally. She gave me a sad smile. "They're simpler, at least. Thank you for not pressing charges. I know you could have." I thought about it, but I decided that getting you out of the neighborhood and getting the money back was enough. I'm not interested in revenge, Patricia. I just wanted my telescope dome and some peace and quiet. You got a lot more than that." "Yeah, I guess I did." We parted ways and I finished my shopping. I never saw her again after that day, but I heard through the extended network of HOA gossip that she had gotten a job as a bookkeeper for a small business in Tucson. No position of authority, no access to other people's money. Just a regular job, paying her bills, living a regular life. Maybe that was punishment enough. Or maybe it was just what she needed. The years rolled on. My observatory dome stood proudly in my backyard, a testament to the idea that sometimes the right response to bureaucratic bullying is not compliance but resistance. Kids in the neighborhood grew up knowing that if you wanted to see something amazing, you could knock on Mr. Norris's door and he would show you the universe. Southwest Grid Services continued to provide reliable power to thousands of homes and businesses. We never had a major outage, never gouged customers on rates, never cut corners on maintenance. It was not glamorous work, but it was honest work, and I took pride in it. Orion Systems eventually got acquired by a larger defense contractor for an amount of money that made even Marcus whistle in appreciation. I could have retired completely at that point, but I kept running Southwest Grid Services because I enjoyed it. There was something grounding about managing infrastructure, about dealing with the physical world instead of just code and contracts. I dated a bit, nothing serious, and spent a lot of time on my hobbies. Astronomy, of course, but also hiking and photography and learning to play the piano at age 47 because why not? Life did not have to be about constant growth and achievement. Sometimes it was okay to just exist and appreciate what you had built. The HOA kept functioning with its new transparent approach. Property values in Meadowbrook Heights stayed strong, not because of aggressive enforcement of trivial rules, but because people actually wanted to live in a community where neighbors treated each other with respect. The architecture was diverse and interesting. People felt free to express themselves within reasonable bounds. It turned out that giving people some autonomy did not lead to chaos and declining property values. It just led to a more interesting, vibrant neighborhood. On the 5-year anniversary of the day I had officially taken over Southwest Grid Services, I threw a party at my house. I invited all the employees, my business partners, neighbors, friends, and basically anyone who had been part of the journey. We set up tables in my backyard, catered food from a local barbecue place, and had a live band playing classic rock covers. As the sun set and the sky darkened, I opened up the observatory dome for anyone who wanted to look through the telescope. The line stretched across my yard, kids and adults waiting patiently for their turn to see Jupiter or Saturn or the Ring Nebula or whatever else I could find. I stood there, watching people's faces light up when they first saw Saturn's rings, or realized that fuzzy patch was actually a galaxy containing billions of stars, and I thought about how strange life was. How a simple desire to pursue a hobby had led to confrontation with a corrupt HOA president, which had led to buying a utility company, which had led to all of this. If Patricia had just approved my observatory dome in the first place, none of this would have happened. I would have my telescope, sure, but I would not have Southwest Grid Services. I would not have learned about utility infrastructure or renewable energy or the satisfaction of providing an essential service. I would not have become the kind of person who throws star parties for neighborhood kids. In a weird way, I was almost grateful to her. Not for the harassment or the fines or the bureaucratic nonsense, but for pushing me to a point where I had to decide whether I was going to roll over or push back. And in pushing back, I had discovered capabilities and interests I never knew I had. The party wound down around midnight. I helped clean up, said goodbye to the last lingering guests, and then went back to my observatory dome. I sat in the darkness, listening to the quiet hum of the telescope's tracking motor as it followed the rotation of the Earth, keeping whatever celestial object I was viewing centered in the eyepiece. The fine that had started everything, that $500 penalty for an unauthorized structure, was framed on the wall of my office at Southwest Grid Services. People ask me sometimes why I kept it, whether it was some kind of trophy or reminder. It was simpler than that. It was a reminder that most fights worth fighting start over something small. Not because the small thing itself matters that much, but because the small thing represents something larger. Freedom, dignity, the right to pursue your interests without arbitrary interference from petty tyrants. Patricia had thought she could bully me into compliance because that was what had always worked before. She had built a little empire of fear and control, and no one had ever challenged her effectively. But she had made a mistake in targeting me, or maybe I had just reached a point in my life where I was not willing to be pushed around anymore. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human drama. Galaxies collided in slow motion over millions of years. Stars were born and died. Planets orbited their suns in mathematical precision. And down here on Earth, in a backyard in Chandler, Arizona, one man sat in his observatory dome and felt grateful for the strange path his life had taken. I never did get around to submitting that architectural review appeal through proper channels. Did not need to. The new HOA board had approved the dome retroactively and issued a formal apology for the previous board's overreach. They even updated the architectural guidelines to be more reasonable and flexible, focusing on legitimate community concerns rather than arbitrary aesthetic control. The $100 daily fines never materialized either, since Patricia had backed down once she realized I owned the power grid. That particular threat had evaporated like morning dew in the Arizona sun. I thought about all the money I had spent buying Southwest Grid Services, the time and effort and stress of the acquisition. $13.5 million plus legal fees and due diligence costs. It would take years before the utility's profits paid back that investment, even with Marcus's capital contribution. Was it worth it? By any rational financial analysis, probably not. I could have just paid the fines and removed the dome or fought it through the legal system. Either option would have been cheaper and simpler. But some decisions are not about money. They are about principle, about autonomy, about refusing to let someone else dictate how you live your life. The observatory dome was worth fighting for not because of its monetary value, but because it represented my right to pursue my interests on my own property within reasonable bounds. And in fighting for that right, I had accidentally built something larger and more meaningful than I had intended. A utility company that served its customers with integrity. A neighborhood that functioned as an actual community. A group of kids who looked up at the stars and wondered what was out there. Not a bad outcome for what started as a petty HOA dispute. I powered down the telescope and closed the observatory dome for the night. The sky would still be there tomorrow and the night after that and every night for the rest of my life. The stars were patient. They could wait. I walked back to my house, locked up and went to bed. In the morning, I would wake up and go check on operations at Southwest Grid Services. There would be customer calls to review, maintenance schedules to approve, billing issues to resolve. The ordinary work of keeping the lights on for thousands of people. And maybe, if there was time, I would make some adjustments to the telescope. There was a new camera I wanted to try out, better suited for deep sky astrophotography. The Andromeda Galaxy was coming into good viewing position, and I wanted to capture it in detail. Life was full of projects and possibilities. The find that Patricia had delivered on that Tuesday morning, The find that had seemed like such a disaster at the time had opened doors I never knew existed. I had walked through those doors and found a larger world on the other side. Sometimes the best revenge is not revenge at all. It is simply living well, pursuing your interests, building something worthwhile, and refusing to let small-minded people make you small. The observatory dome stood dark and silent in my backyard, a monument to the power of principled stubbornness. Tomorrow night, or the night after, or whenever the sky was clear and I had time, I would open it up again and point my telescope at something distant and beautiful. But for now, I slept peacefully, knowing that my property was mine, my dome was approved, and my community was thriving. Patricia's attempt to fine me into submission had backfired so spectacularly that it had transformed not just my life but the entire neighborhood. And that, more than any amount of money or any legal victory, was the sweetest outcome I could have imagined. The HOA had fined me for my observatory dome, so I had bought the electric grid servicing their entire neighborhood. In the end, we both got exactly what we deserved.